Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the second day of the 27th annual conference of the International Sustainable Development Research Society. We were enjoying so many good presentations yesterday, keynote speakers, and very exciting panel discussions, and we are looking forward to a great day today. Yesterday we focused on environmental sustainability in the panel discussion, and this afternoon we will focus on social sustainability. Yes, and I hope that you are enjoying the conference very much, and I will hand over to my colleague, Professor Volker Mauerhofer.
Thank you very much also from my side. A good day to you, all of you, and I hope you enjoyed also our little introductory videos. The first video was actually from the city where the first campus of Mid-Sweden University is located, Sundsvall, and the second shorter video was from Östersund. So great to have you all with us again today. Please also ready ahead visit our poster sessions at lunchtime, and later Katrin will say a little bit more about this poster session. It's my pleasure now to start also with a very special event which we have every year at our annual conference, and that is actually our Best Paper Award, so the ISDRS Best Paper Award, and I will share with you a little presentation about this award. And we have a very special situation this year because our award is with us, so they will be later in a little conversation with us. So what is this Best Paper Award of ISDRS? So we have since 2017 this award, and we try to identify and honor the best sustainable development related research papers. So we try to stimulate solid research by that, and also to support the introduction of solution to these challenges which we face ahead. And what we really appreciate is a participatory approach. Everyone connected to ISDRS can suggest papers which have been written in that year, and a jury decides then about nominated papers, and ISDR members and followers vote for that article. The winners, as I mentioned, they are honored each year during our annual conference. And next slide, please. These are the board members who are involved in this procedure, and it's quite very much work actually to read all those papers. And also there are members of ISDRS which are included in this procedure. And we really thank all those members to read all those papers, give their feedback on the papers, and contribute in this way to this important award. And we are so happy that you do this and that you're with us in this award procedure. Next slide, please. So we had also some runners-up, so that were people actually on papers which were coming into the best 3 papers, and those were theoretical perspectives on organizations and organizing in a post-growth area by S.B. Banerjee, G.M. Jamier, Peredo A.M., Barry R., and Andre Reichel. Second runners-up was Spaceship Earth's Odyssey to a Circular Economy, a century-long perspective. I think from my home country, Walter Haas, Fridolin Grossmann, D. Wiedenhofer, C. Locke, and A. Meyer. So these are the papers who made it also into the selection of the best 3 papers, and we also thank them for participating and for congratulating them. This year's winner was one of the runners-up in the past years. This is also a sign that people come up into the competition, they made it to the best 3, and perhaps next year we see their names among our winners. So it's now, and next slide please. My great honor, the winners of the 2020 Best Sustainability Development article are, next slide. So this is the paper. It's our Anne Wachold, Prachal Prachan, and Jürgen Gropp. It's about variations in Sustainable Development Goal interactions, population, regional, and income disaggregation in the journal Sustainable Development with Wiley. And this is announced by Marlene G. Arnold. She's the chair of our jury. She's our board member of ISDRS. And she's currently on sabbatical leave, so she couldn't participate in this session here and in this conference. And we thank you for her chairing of this committee, and we congratulate the winners Anne, Prachal, and Jürgen very much. And as I said already at the beginning, we are, and also President Peter Dovers is, I think, with us. We are very honored that you even make it to this session. Up on short-term notice, I have to say, and we would like you to come in now into the session, and we would perhaps like to have from both of you a few words, and thank you for being with us, and thank you for making yourself available to this session. I wonder who want to start, Anne or Prachal. Anne, perhaps you're the first author of the paper.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. And yeah, well, actually, this paper is based on my master thesis. Oh. And I need to thank there probably Prajal, because he was my supervisor during the process, also during the process of making a paper out of this. And I also presented this work yesterday in a parallel session. So maybe a few of you were there. So yeah, I would just say thank you. It was a great honor and a little bit surprising for me, but I'm also grateful. So I think I can hand over to Prajal.
Okay. Thank you so much for your kind words, and we are really honored to have you with us. And yeah, if I would have been aware of this a little bit earlier, I would have put you in a session after this session, because then, of course, you would have perhaps even more participants in your session. Sorry for this, but thank you for being with us and for presenting your paper also here, and welcome again. Prachal, the floor is yours.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Volker, and thank you to the jury, yeah, and for selecting and shortlisting our paper for this award, and all those followers and the member for voting our paper as one of the best paper here. Yeah. So yeah, as Anna mentioned, this is really a nice piece of work that was done during the master thesis process of Anna. And I would like to highlight like one key message of this paper, mainly that here in this paper, we tried different statistical approaches to understand SDG interactions quantitatively using the big data that is available from UN statistics. So not going too much detail here, one of the key messages in my point of view that is coming out of this paper is like, when you talk about SDGs, we need to prioritize our implementation measures for looking for like a marginal group. Either that would be women, young population, rural population, and so on. So reducing equality would be really a key aspect to leverage sustainable development goals. So this would be like a one-line key message coming out of this paper. And I think we had yesterday a session here where we discussed a lot about inequality. And the good news is that this paper is open access. Like it was open access based on this deal with German institutes, with Willy, that it's open access and it's available for all. Like I just in the chat, I just sent the link about this paper. So if you are interested further, please have a look on the paper, and you have some questions, please come back to Anna or me. We are happy to provide more information about this paper. And also, if there is someone wants to apply this sort of methodology for their further research, we are also welcome for collaboration. And Volker and all the colleagues behind the scene, I saw this picture where it looks like the Meet University in Sweden is something like a call center now for organizing the conference. So there are so many computers, so many headphones. Yeah, I have a feeling like it's really a big team behind them. So I thank all those hard work guys who are doing all this job to make this online conference a success. I thank them all also from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pachal, for your kind words. It's really wonderful also for us to, and really happy to have you with us. Just some points. It's the best paper award of ISDS. It's of all papers which are published in the field of sustainability in 2020. So it's not only for this conference. It's really, we looked at the literature in SCI, Web of Science, Scopus. So it's a little bit bigger than just for this conference, yeah. So and following up, to have a master thesis published in this way and awarded in this way, it's really something very special. And that's also for our Mid-Sweden university students and for all master students which are now participating in this session in all other universities, something like an incentive. You can do it too if you want, yeah? It's up to you. Write a good paper in a master thesis, publish it, and you might get an award for best paper. So that's really something to follow up with for everybody and also every supervisor, yeah? So it's really great stuff. And I forgot before to say what the award is actually. It's 3 things. So all 3 authors of the paper will have a free membership for 1 year from ISDRS. All 3 authors will have a free participation in the next year's conference. And all 3 authors get 10 trees, each of them from us, planted with this organization which I mentioned already yesterday, together with the plenary speakers and the keynote speakers. So that's our prize for you, all the 3 of us, all the 3 of you, all the 3 paper awardees. So Pachal, Anne, thank you for being with us, and we hope you enjoy the conference also. And we will do our best that it's technically also done like in the past day, so there were not many things, I think, which went wrong, so everything was rather smooth. And I would like to finalize this Best Paper Award Committee procedure now. And I wonder, this was the last slide, or is there another slide? Yeah, so just again, this is from your paper, and we mentioned already it's published in Sustainable Development as a paper. And thank you again for being with us. I think we have still some. If you want to say a little bit more about your paper, there's still a possibility because we have now some slides on there. Could you go back to the presentation? And Prachal, we have this slide on there about your paper. If you want to just say some words more about this.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in.
Yeah, please.
So basically what we did, we designed cross-sectional correlational research, as Prajat said, using the UN database, what is officially available. And we wanted to kind of classify SDG interactions not only as synergies and trade-offs, but also according to their monotony and linearity. So as I said, we look at this holistically. So we consider all 17 SDGs, and if you have this huge database, we want to know which interaction is actually maybe nonlinear. And with nonlinearity, you can also push really for rapid progress. You can save maybe investments, but this could in some cases also be beneficial and in other cases hindering the development. So we should always be aware also of trade-offs. And we can say that generally socially oriented SDGs show more variation in interactions than environmentally and economically oriented SDGs. This is the case globally, but if you look at the income and regional level, this is a little bit different, and this is because countries within those groups tend to follow other countries which have a similar logic or similar development pathways. And then also, as Praja pointed out, what is quite important, and that's why we put this figure here, that the female, younger, and rural population have really mostly synergies, showing that Leave No One Behind can really leverage the achievements of the SDGs, what was a really good starting point in 2016. but would also mean that still they're really like left behind and have a lot of disadvantaged positions, what we really need to leverage for a successful implementation. And yeah, and then again, maybe push a little bit the non-linearity development pathways of SDGs, also like in this trend of COVID, where we really have like a limited available of time to really push for progress. Okay, thanks.
Rachel, do you want to add something?
No, thank you. Anna already mentioned that quite in a good way. So, and I thank you for all. Thank you very much.
No, I'm a little bit old and I cannot read the text above the columns. So I wonder if you would additionally just describe what are the colors in the columns stand for. That would be helpful perhaps for also the auditorium. And read perhaps, so the column next to the text, what does the column?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So generally, as I said, with this characteristic of SDG interactions, we have synergies, trade-offs, but we have also linear and non-linear interactions. And we also try to detect non-monotonic associations. And this is kind of the coloring. So blue would be synergistic interactions and red would be trade-offs. And then the lighter colors would be something being linear and the darker colors would be something non-linear. With our correlation comparison, so we use a wider range of correlation methods. So we were not able to detect anything being non-monotonic, but we detected a lot of non-linear relations. This is more the case also at the global level, since we there have different segments and not so much for the population groups. Since, as I said, their countries tend to more follow countries within the same group. But in this figure, as you can see, we distinguished certain population groups. So you have the gender, so female and male population. You have the age, so younger and elderly population, and urban and rural population. And then we compared like the share of synergies, what would be everything blue, to red would be trade-offs, or being something not classified, so rather weak associations or random associations, which is yellow. And so we got there then a little bit more into detail, analyzing really some specific interactions within our paper, but I think this would be too much right now.
Yeah, no, it's more clear now, I think, for everybody, and with the colors, it's quite well described. So thank you so much for more in detail pointing out the content of that slide and more in detail explaining the substance of your research. So thank you again for being with us. We hope to have you with us at next year's conference in, again, Sweden. I can mention it. It's random, but it's again this country. So our president also thanked you in the chat. So Peter sent you a message of gratitude. So thank you for this wonderful paper, for presenting it at the conference, for being now with us in the session, and hope to have you continuously with us in the next years. And bring more master students like this to our conference. Great, thank you. Without further ado, I'm handing over.
Also from my side, congratulations to this Best Paper Award, and just to notice again that you have the link to the paper in the chat, so you can access it, and it's great also that you mentioned that it's open access. So very, very inspiring. And we are also looking forward to an inspiring program today. This morning, in just a few minutes, we are going to listen to Åsa Persson, the keynote speaker this morning. She is a research director and deputy director at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And after Åsa speaks, there will be a possibility to have a discussion and questions and answers to Åsa. And we hope that you all stay on for this keynote. And after this keynote, we will have a parallel session going on before lunch. And then, as yesterday, you can check out the colorful program on the website and see the track of your favorite, or perhaps also switch between the tracks if there are some particularly interesting presentations that you want to attend. And then at 1 o'clock, we are going to have the lunch break, but I just also want to remind you that during the lunch break, we have also the poster session going on. And there you can attend and interact with the poster presenters and ask them questions on their posters. We have a little bit more than 30 different posters, and we have split them between the different lunch breaks. So there will be posters from yesterday and also been into this lunch break. But a number of poster presenters will be there for today, and you can see them in the program on the website. And after the lunch break in the poster session at 2, we will gather here in the studio again for the next panel presentation. And we have 3 panelists this afternoon. We have Marie-Claire Condornier-Seger, Georgie Carino, and Marcos Regita Silva, and they are all going to do individual presentations at first, and then we will have a panel discussion and also a questions and answer session. And the focus of this discussion is on social sustainability and the sustainable development goals. And after that panel discussion, we will then go back again to the different parallel sessions, and as Prayal mentioned, you could see in the slides from the beginning of this session this morning that we have a big team helping us, and the staff that are working with these parallel sessions and hosting these Zoom webinars. They are around 15 people working with this, and also a number of students helping us to being hosts in Zoom and support to the chairs of the parallel sessions. Yes.
Maybe a short announcement also. We have today the mentorship mingle, which starts in the late afternoon after the second parallel sessions. And there's at the beginning for 30 minutes, it's those people who are already in the mentorship program, but afterwards the session would be really open for people who are interested in this mentorship program of ISDRS, and that is organized by Hannah Alström. So please get in contact also and think about participating in this mentorship mingle and in this event and in the program. That's the first for the day in the evening. And for tomorrow morning we have the second membership meeting. So we do 2 membership meetings. One was yesterday evening already for those people who are in the time zone that is better for yesterday evening. And for tomorrow morning there's for the people who are in other time zones another opportunity to join. And that's not only the members, but we also invite non-members to have a look what the society is about and what the society can offer to them. So that's 2 final announcements, and I hand over again to my colleague Katrin. And
yes,
thank you.
we also have a meeting for the the after conference meeting. You will find that link to that session in the program as well. So we have a few minutes now before we are going to introduce Åsa Persson. So we are taking a short break and we will be back in a few minutes.
Okay. Welcome
Yes.
again.
Hello, we are back again, and we are proud to announce the next keynote speaker of the second day of the conference. And we are happy to have Åsa Persson with us. As I said, hello, welcome Åsa. She is a research director and deputy director at the Stockholm Environment Institute in Stockholm, and also adjunct lecturer at the Department for Thematic Studies at Linköping University. And your research is focused on global governance, including implementation of the SDGs and climate change adaptation and planetary boundaries framework. So particularly, and that is also what you're going to talk about today, I think the policy coherence and also the focus on inequality in implementing the SDGs. So we would also like to mention that you have been appointed by the UN Secretary General to the independent group of scientists to prepare the 2023 Global Sustainable Development Report, and that is really great. And you're also a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project. And you have a background in environmental policy, and your PhD was from the London School of Economics. So very welcome, Åsa. It's great to have you here.
Also, thank you also from my side. We didn't know each other, but I approached you directly because I found your research very interesting and relevant. And actually, we were competitors in this Formers project call last year for this conflicts among and synergies among SDGs. You were in the first round and then also won the project in the second round. Were one of the winners of that project, as far as I remember. We unfortunately didn't receive the grant, but I read your topic and I found it very interesting once I saw the grant announcement. And yeah, maybe I'm looking forward really if you can explain to us also a little bit about this research going on in this grant. So there's much ongoing in your institute, I think, and you may also explain a little bit the background of your institute, because I learned that it's related to universities as far as understood, but it's more or less private financed, yeah, and that's quite maybe you might have some public funding, but main financing comes from grants like this and from research like this, so it's quite amazing to maintain a big institute like this, yeah, and I think you do quite well what I see on the website, so. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. I will actually begin by just checking that you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those very kind words and for inviting me to give a talk at this conference. Well, first of all, I hope that everyone attending is keeping well. We spend a lot of time on screen these days, so we also need to re-energize off screen. And I'm very glad that you've taken the time to join us on this summer day, and probably also very inconvenient time zones for many people. So Folke, you mentioned a couple of things there in the introduction on the Global Sustainable Development Report. It's correct, I'm part of that group of independent scientists. There are 15 of us to draft that report. We have begun our work, working for a few months, but we're in a very formative stage now, including thinking about, can we recycle the framework from the first GSDR that came out in 2019. So I would particularly welcome researchers at this conference to also give us inputs, feedback on the first report, and also highlighting really important research for the next Global Sustainable Development Report. We're going to issue a call for inputs very soon. So there will be a formal opportunity, but I also welcome you to contact me. You also mentioned the Stockholm Environment Institute, where I'm research director. Indeed, we work with applied sustainability research and have done so for more than 30 years. We're actually delighted to have more competition in that space, applied research, and more scholars wishing to really engage and have societal impact in this decade of action that we're in. And I could also mention that we are now busy preparing for the Stockholm +50 conference next year. It will be a UN meeting hosted in Stockholm in June 2022. Our institute, the Stockholm Environment Institute, was named after that conference, and now we're looking to commemorate that conference, but also the Swedish government as a host has explained that they really want to also push the agenda and raise new emerging issues that need to be dealt with within the sustainable development space. So watch that space. So let me move into the talk today. I will share my screen with you and start the slideshow. There we go. I hope everyone can see the slides well, and please come in from the technical support if there are problems.
It looks great, Åsa.
Very good. I'll also keep an eye on the time, but I also welcome the moderators to let me know when it's time to wrap up. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes is the idea, and then have some time for questions and answers. So I wanted to be a bit provocative today. Let's see if you do find it provocative or if these are old truths to you. But I think it's as it's getting more urgent to make progress on sustainable development. It's really time to see how we can perhaps politicize the SDGs more. And I think in order to do that, you need to seriously tackle inequality. This relates to the research I'm doing on policy coherence, in that we see that policy coherence is often a kind of, it's seen as a technical issue, something that bureaucrats will consider in the policy making process. But what we have seen in our research is that it's actually very, I mean, these are very political goals. It's a political process of prioritizing these goals, and a key factor there is exactly inequality and distributional aspects. But before going into this title and topic more, I wanted to ask you to think about, just close your eyes for a couple of minutes, think about what is the image that pops up in your head when you think about sustainable development? I know you're all working on this, you have so many thoughts, we write papers, a lot of text, but what's the kind of visual image that you see? So I hope you have that image in your head now. And I'm curious to know if this is the kind of image you get, where sustainable development is really a kind of a happy place. It's a very good, promising vision of the future, where we work together, everyone can sort of satisfy their basic needs, and more than that, hopefully work together. And I chose here a picture, the Good Life Goals representation of the SDGs, which I think is an excellent project, and it's really taps into interesting behavioral research on the need to have to provide this kind of attractive vision of sustainable development, something you want to buy into and join rather than fear. But looking at these smileys here, you can see that it presents an idea that we can live better, we can love nature, make peace, come together. It's a bit like a Beatles song in a good way. However, this is quite contrasting with what we often see in the media headlines, and I chose a few pictures here. It's a picture from South Africa, food aid distribution in the aftermath of the pandemic crisis and sort of unemployment and poverty. It's a picture very recent from wildfires in California, the heat wave there, which has where climate change has contributed to that extreme weather. And also a picture from research by my SEI colleagues on income groups and which income groups are responsible for the increase in global emissions of carbon dioxide. As you can see there, the richest 5% are responsible for more than a third of the increase in global emissions since 1990. So very unequal situation, as I'm sure you all know. So I think what's interesting here is that these are very two contrasting views. And in my view, there is a kind of growing tension here between these, which is probably kind of caused by the urgency that we are now facing to make changes, maybe reinforced by the crisis we're in with the pandemic. The question is, though, can they be reconciled, or what would be a kind of productive level of tension as opposed to having these two framings operating very independently? That's what I will try to get at in this talk. So with the title, Why Sustainable Development Must Tackle Inequality, you could really legitimately ask, isn't that stating the obvious? I would say no, because what I find is that inequality and distributional aspects are often typically avoided in the policy and practice of sustainable development. And this means that sustainable development remains depoliticized. So I will try to demonstrate a bit how, and also give you some propositions why that may be. I'll argue that addressing inequality really must be part of effective SDG action. And you will note here, I'm not arguing it must be part of just SDG action. Of course, it's really important to address inequality from a kind of moral perspective, but I will leave that to really qualified moral philosophers. So I will approach this more as from a perspective of effectiveness, looking at empirical relationships between inequality and sustainable development. A second point here is that SDG action must be actively politicized. It must be infused with some political energy, conflict, tension to have traction on the ground by raising the stakes and reducing what I call unproductive conflict avoidance. So I chose here this image of cogwheels, which I think is sort of hopefully conveying that point, that in order to get that wheel to start turning, the sustainable development goals, it really needs to tap into inequality debates, and this also means recognizing the politics here. I'll give you a cliffhanger. I will suggest a fourth cogwheel towards the end. So let's talk a little bit about inequality. And the relationship here, I think, in my mind, there are at least three relationships. Of course, we do have an SDG on reducing inequalities, number 10. I think this is, in my view, it's the most controversial and most unexpected of the SDGs. I was quite surprised when I first read the resolution in 2015. In particular, targets number 1 and 4 address economic inequalities explicitly. And the first target there actually sets a quantified target that to progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. So this really sort of, in my view, addresses, well, it goes into the more traditionally national policy space. Traditionally, the UN has, sort of global governance has not really addressed issues of inequality and using fiscal policies, taxes, transfers to redistribute income and wealth. It also, of course, has a strong ideological dimensions or political dimensions. But it is a goal, and as such, it should be achieved. But I would say inequality can also be seen as a means that will have effects on other SDGs. And I think this is the way we should think about all the SDGs. Of course, things like energy access would also have positive and negative effects on other SDGs. So there's nothing unique really about inequality in that way. But I do think it's very important to, especially given the trends we are seeing with inequality, to look at the effects on other SDGs at really a kind of macro level or system level, if you like. And finally, I think it's important to recognize that all measures for sustainable development, policy instruments, initiatives will often have distributional effects. So in order to get acceptance for these measures, it's wise to really address distributional effects. Right, so what do we know about inequality as a goal, the SDG 10? We can look at the last GSDR, and I think this is one of the few actually compilations, the scorecards, which looks at all the SDGs together at the global level. And you can see there that there are actually some negative long-term trends with regards to inequality of income. I apologize for the small text here, but you'll find this picture in the 2019 GSDR. And it's in a company of the so-called environmental SDGs, where we know that there are these negative long-term trends rather than progress and sort of where we are on our way to reach the goals. So it is quite an outlier for being a more kind of economically or socially oriented SDG. And then, of course, the pandemic came, as we were not on track before the pandemic. And as we all know now, global poverty is expected to really increase, extreme poverty in particular. And this is really quite shocking. It has not happened in at least 2 decades, not with the last financial crisis. So you could see there in terms of poverty headcount, we were on this blue path and seeing a reduction in poverty was the expectation in this scenario work. But now we have shifted up, we're on that higher trajectory. And the question is, of course, open. Will we land closer to the red line there or the green line? Looking more, less at the global level, going to the national level within countries, income inequality is, unfortunately, there's a lack of data. So it's hard to measure progress, which is unfortunate and which also has political dimensions. But before the pandemic, again, if we look at the figure on the left-hand side, we can see that since 1990, the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, and the higher that coefficient is, the more unequal a society is. It had increased in many advanced economies. In emerging market and developing economies, a little bit less clear pattern, both increases and decreases in equality. But what the IMF concluded last year in their economic outlook was that income inequality is expected to increase by some 6% in emerging market and developing economies. It's also interesting, of course, to look at what can be done about the problem through redistributive measures like taxes and transfers and grants. And I thought this was a very interesting diagram. It's from the UN Secretary General's SDG report released just last week at the HLPF. It shows that generally high-income countries have an easier time redistributing, so kind of reducing inequality. So here you see that the effects of the pre-Gini index before you introduce these redistributive taxes or transfers compared with upper middle income countries and lower middle income countries. And this has many explanations. I won't go into them here. It relates to the stability and size of the tax base, sort of general institutional capacity, etc. But it's worrying because it suggests it's much harder for developing countries to really reduce inequality. But then, as I mentioned, inequality is also a means, not just a goal. And I think here we are, the research suggests that there are 2 kind of pathways here, mechanisms. One is that inequality as such sort of can is associated or drives various consumption patterns with negative effects on environmental sustainability. So there's a research field that has tried to isolate the effect of income inequality vis-a-vis other potential drivers, like just the level of income, GDP per capita, or other potential drivers, explanatory factors. But the other mechanism here is more indirect, and this would be that inequality can lead to lower social trust and social cohesion in societies, and this in turn is associated with lower environmental sustainability. I'm not a statistician, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just wanted to give you some examples also of these correlations between inequality and environmental sustainability. So on the left there, you see the relationship with biodiversity loss across countries. It's not very straight line, but there is a correlation there. And a correlation has also been established with municipal waste generation. I already showed you this figure, but I think it's really telling, and it's interesting from the point of view of looking at global income groups, because as you know, another trend is that perhaps it's not inequality between countries that is so, well, that is actually reducing, but inequality within countries is increasing. So there's been a huge debate this year on whether it's actually the ultra rich that are the problem, whether it's excessive affluence that is the problem, rather than, as traditionally seen in sustainable development, the problems of underdevelopment. And finally, and I actually believe we have the author of this paper maybe in this conference today, but a very interesting systematic comparison, looking at indicators for the SDGs and looking at correlations. Again, we don't have the time to go into this in detail here, and maybe the authors can also comment on this, especially SDG 10. But basically, I think a conclusion here is that SDG 10 is intimately connected to other SDGs. Lots of synergies, positive interactions, but also some negative interactions. So it's very important as a means for other goals. And finally, as I mentioned, we have found in our ongoing research that measures for SDGs will often have distributional effects. We actually started out looking at interactions between climate goals, SDG 13, and other SDGs, but found that it's this SDG 10 that is sort of a little bit the source of conflict, whether that's an explicit conflict or kind of a dormant implicit conflict, and also where we think if addressing inequality, maybe that can unlock action. So this plays out, for example, in the just energy transition debates in Germany and South Africa. In Sweden, our case study suggests that a main kind of conflict line is between the urban and rural populations and their access to mobility, etc., and the impact of climate policy on that. So I think hopefully this is a strong case why inequality is important. You probably knew all this already, but I think very interestingly, despite this, SDG 10 is the least mentioned goal in the voluntary national reviews. This is a study of 100 voluntary national reviews, which are the country reports on SDG progress submitted to the UN High-Level Political Forum. They are a little bit dated, so maybe it has now changed. It would be very interesting to update this analysis, but as you can see, it's quite striking how it's really the least addressed SDG among all the 17. This result is also confirmed by an analysis that SEI did together with the German Development Institute, where researchers looked at and coded all the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the national climate plans submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change under the Paris Agreement. And again, you see that SDG 10 is not really addressed a lot in those NDCs. Before trying to explain why this may be, I just wanted to very quickly recognize that, of course, there are options to address economic inequality. They are well known, laid out, used a lot. So this is not a new territory in any way. I think this was a useful summary by researchers at Harvard, distinguishing also how can you address inequality targeting these different income groups. So for the top earners, it's more about wealth taxes, estate taxes, but for the bottom earners, it's, you can have measures like universal basic income, minimum wage policies, and also various forms of government transfers. So moving on here, I see we are getting closer to the 30 minutes. So politics. Why do we have the situation that inequality is not really addressed explicitly? And I chose deliberately here the picture from 1972, the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. This is Indira Gandhi giving her seminal speech. And I think I just reread that speech also, as I mentioned, part of our kind of preparations for the Stockholm +50 meeting next year. Sustainable development was really highly political at the time. This conference actually did not kind of coin that term specifically, but of course was addressing the issue of environment and development. It had very strong social dimensions and really addressing both the problem of underdevelopment again and many of those former colonies being decolonized, wanting to industrialize quickly and also benefit from the same type of development progress that industrialized countries had. Indira Gandhi also recognized already back then very insightful the problem of excessive affluence. It is a fascinating read. It also relates to other types of inequalities beyond income. It's about racial discrimination, apartheid, geopolitics. So it really actually, I mean, many of those issues are still with us today. But the point I wanted to make here is that I do feel a little bit similar to that first image of sustainable development. There is a certain level of cognitive dissonance going on, perhaps. Originally, sustainable development was sort of conceived as a principle for how to develop. So is a certain development, a trend, sustainable over time? And as you know, this sort of came, was applied in fields like fisheries. Can you maintain a yield? Is it sustainable at a certain level? So I think this suggests that, sustainable development is really all pervasive because development is everything. And also, I think it's very easy to sort of come to the conclusion that, of course, all kinds of developments inherently redistribute income opportunities or wealth in some way or another, from very negligible to very very major ways. But then we have this framing with the SDGs, possibly as a kind of more apolitical agenda. And I think what we see a lot these days is that different organizations, not just governments, but also businesses, research institutes like my own, we sort of try to connect our work with the SDGs. We tag the SDGs. We say we contribute to SDGs number X, Y, and Z. But I think a risk here is that it becomes a sort of added layer to mainstream politics. It's not seen as that sort of priority principle or goal, overarching goal that really matters to political leaders or their voters. But it's sort of floating above or on the sides. And I Also, when we look at how the institutions for sustainable development have evolved, which of course started much earlier than 2015 and SDGs, we often see separate kind of dedicated institutions, whether commissions, task forces, cross-departmental working groups, but they sort of work according to their own logic sometimes. So I would suggest there are two issues here. One is that SDGs somehow, there is a risk that it really becomes this sort of separate, unique policy field and separate and unique community of practice, rather than this kind of feature of development in a very broad sense. And also related trend that SDGs are sort of depoliticized. There's a lack of this explicit distributional positive conflicts. There's a lack of mobilization of interest groups when we talk about the SDGs compared to when we talk about, you know, other issues that are not that don't have the prefix of SDGs, like unemployment or expanding the road infrastructure, etc. The global governance scholar Oren Young, I think, made a very strong comment in 2015 when the SDGs were released, that it's really about classical interest politics, and this is not necessarily a bad thing. So let me offer you three perspectives drawing on some theory why it may be the case that the SDGs are depoliticized. And the first one, they're looking at the governance literature and public policy literature. You may have seen this idea that SDGs represent governance through goals rather than governance through rules, which has been the traditional way of global governance and international law. So Frank Bierman and colleagues have looked at this as a novel approach. It has potential, clearly. It was more a bottom-up process. It's non-confrontational, invites actors to join the SDG agenda. It's country-driven, and it's oriented to many stakeholders. But also risks that commitments are not formalized, governance arrangements are weak, and will they really translate to national context? Will sectors be integrated? They are actually about to release a major impact assessment of SDGs as governance through goals next year, so that will be a very interesting read. But I think this idea that SDGs could be effective as governance through goals is can be contrasted with very traditional insights from the public policy literature, which states that goals like the SDGs can be pursued actually through a number of different policy instruments, each with highly different distributional impacts. So really you need to kind of focus much more downstream, of course. Also the insight that often goals are vague, which I think is the case for many of the SDGs, which in effect results in a means-end approach in policy rather than ends means. So the instruments chosen acquire much more significance, and that's where interest groups mobilize. Finally, that policy objectives and goals are often only deliberately symbolic and more easily to agree on. And it's again at the choice of instrument at that stage where you have the ideological and political controversies played out. So we can expect that politics play out more at the stage of designing actual policy instruments or actions, and that the goals in and of themselves may not deliver action or uncover these conflicts. And hence, there's a need then to either try to somehow politicize SDGs or really try to shift the focus in the sustainability policy discourse a little bit away from the goals and more to the instruments and measures. A second explanation here, I wanted to draw on a really interesting paper by Ryan Wong and Jaren van der Heijden. And they proposed that there is a number of conflict avoidance behaviors going on among sustainable development bureaucrats, which they studied in a number of countries. And that they actually avoid conflict through different strategies to hide and exclude them. And they do this at also different stages, at prioritizing issues, delivering on them, and resolving them. So as you can see there in the second column from the left, on the type of conflict avoidance behavior, you have the purposeful conflict avoidance, where these bureaucrats deem it's too political, so they try to hide those conflicts. And when they're only subtly political, then they can be dealt with by the SD community, as they say. And then there are other types of conflict avoidance behaviors. For example, the idea that concrete commitments provoke more conflict than more abstract ones. Substantive commitments provoke more conflict than commitments relating to process. And the idea that what they often seek is a balancing of views. Everyone needs to be included in the process rather than sort of opening up for challenges. A third school of thought that has looked at this is a bit older and very well established. It has looked at sustainable development as an empty signifier. This is within critical theory and discourse analysis. So it refers to a word, so sustainable development in this case, that is not without meaning or just vague in general, but it has some functions. It sets some boundaries, what is actually excluded from the discourse, what cannot be really addressed. It serves this unifying function. It brings a lot of actors together, but also obscures conflict. It's subject to constant revision, which I think is very true in the case of sustainable development. Over these 30 or 40 years, we are still providing new definitions. And really the sort of the struggle to try to fix its meaning is in this view determined by hegemonic actors who has the kind of power to provide that master interpretation. Also arguments here that sustainability reinforces the post-political condition. Also very interesting. We don't have so much time to go into that now, but I think you could see this as a kind of course, a negative that is really stalling action, but of course it also has some positive function, bringing actors together, which might have been impossible without this empty signifier. So those were some possible explanations, perspectives. And to wrap up, I wanted to suggest finally perhaps a fourth cogwheel needed to make the SDGs matter, which I would propose is accountability. If you have studied the SDGs and the sort of institutional arrangements and the follow-up and review mechanisms that were set out already in the 2015 resolution, you will see that accountability is really a sideline. It's not really discussed, and a very plausible explanation is, of course, that because the goals are not legally binding, you can't really be held accountable in the same way. There was no guidance to states on how to try and to ensure accountability, either at the kind of national level between actors, or from the national level to the international level through, for example, peer review mechanisms. So what exactly is the function of accountability? Why does it matter? Well, it typically entails three elements: information, answerability, and sanction. So information would be the right to receive and also the obligation to release information of relevance. Answerability is the right to receive an explanation of progress or lack of progress, and a duty to justify one's conduct for the actor responsible. And finally, sanction. This refers to accounting actors. Those holding the responsible actors to account have an ability to reward good behavior and punish improper behavior. So this would mean that there are actually some consequences when it comes to SDG progress. And a very, very good, very important recent paper from the German Development Institute looks at horizontal accountability. So they also did a study of these voluntary national reviews and to what extent they refer to mechanisms for accountability between different states, institutions, organs at the national level. So parliament holding government to account, using audit institutions and human rights institutions. They don't talk so much about vertical accountability. So this is the accountability from of the political leaders to the voters, which I think, in my view, would be really important and needed to really, again, get this traction on sustainable development. Of course, you don't need only to rely on formal accountability mechanisms, but often we have various types of shadow mechanisms. So civil society actually has a campaign on accountability for the SDGs. Media is a really important actor, and also business and shareholders holding their, owners of companies holding their companies to account when they claim to contribute to the SDGs. So I would suggest that this is the fourth cogwheel needed to make the others turn. And it would be great to see more ideas and policy action in that accountability space going forward. So finally, concluding remarks. And so I have tried to argue that to make progress on the SDGs in times of crisis, like now, but also in normal times, they need to matter politically. And typically, goals and measures with clear distributional effects that either increase or reduce inequality do matter politically to political leaders and to voters. So highlighting the issue of inequality, SDG 10, is therefore both a means and an end in itself. A culture of accountability, because I think this is much broader than the formal mechanisms involving these other actors outside of the governmental system. Culture of accountability needs to be nurtured in political systems at different levels to strengthen the responsibility for achieving SDGs and to provide these kind of reward mechanisms to promote good behavior, race to the top. So recognizing sustainable development as political rather than depoliticizing it can help to expose conflicting values and hopefully unlock action. So this was my proposition to you, and I'm very interested in hearing reactions on this. And I'll skip this slide and say a warm thank you.
Thank you very much, Åsa. That was really inspiring, but also a little bit disheartening, I think. And I have also seen in my own research and confirmed that that inequality within, that you said inequalities within countries are increasing, although we are working with this SDG 10, and as you showed, not working enough with this. And I'm thinking that perhaps we need to talk about what the relationship between the goals are, since you mentioned also the effects that inequality have on all the other goals, like poverty, increasing hunger in the world, the climate change, and also education for all, etc. So do you have a first comment on that? And we will soon get into the questions from the chat.
Well, I agree with you that it's very important to try and approach it from that end, which, again, seeing inequality or reducing inequality as a means, not just an end in itself. I think the challenge is that there are no strong, lobby groups around reducing inequality. It's basically those, the bottom income groups, which are very large often and don't have a dedicated interest lobby group to represent them, as you see, for example, with other SDGs, which there might be the energy industry has a strong interest in supporting investments in energy access, for example. So I think that's part of the explanation. So I think we need to find those ways of highlighting reducing inequalities more.
Thank you very much. That's really, really important. Over to the
I would
questions.
like just add to this. It's really a nice observation, which is also that the countries which are in the SDG list rankings on the top, they have nationally the best Gini indexes, like also Sweden included, Norway, Iceland, you name it. But when it comes to the global ecological footprint, those countries show a different sort of inequality, and it's sometimes a paradoxon also in this ranking of countries in the SDGs. But that's just my personal observation. You might want to add afterwards on it. We go into the questions to Åsa, and the first one was actually a comment from somebody who pointed out the official indicator for the bottom 30-40% does not include the comparison with the top, so I leave it there as it is. It's a more comment, I understood, but I would go to the next question then. What kind of measures you think that SDGs related teams could propose to be included in the next Recovering EU COVID program, and in order to reduce inequality? So what would be the measures for reducing inequality? And please remember economic, environmental, social, and governance perspectives. So remember everything. So that would be the first question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me also comment on your observation, Volker, on this correlation between Gini coefficient and SDG performance, etc. I think what's striking when I looked at this research, and maybe I just haven't found it yet, but it's now getting a little bit dated, the research on inequality and sustainability. I hope there is new research coming out, but otherwise I would love to see more work on this, not least to integrate that in the next Global Sustainable Development Report. Because also, as we know, that certain forms of inequality are actually rising also in those Nordic countries, including here in Sweden. On the question of measures, I think what are measures to reduce inequality? Of course, very difficult and big question. And as pointed out, there are so many dimensions of inequality. I try to focus here on income inequality. All are important. I think, in my view, there are these, it's not a given that we need to think about new measures. We do have established mechanisms that work, again, taxes, transfers. So it's more about connecting SDG 10 or sustainable development with those traditional, getting into that mainstream fiscal policy space. Interesting to note there are new ideas, new framings of this, with, for example, the ideas around green new deals in many countries that really try to, for example, use the climate transition to also reduce inequality.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we have another question from the chat. And it says like this: you mentioned inequality in Sweden, SDG 10 being more of a urban-rural divide. How do you suggest that we bridge that increasing gap? Because at the moment there is not even a national debate about this, and how can we address something that we don't even know or think about or acknowledge?
Yeah, I think to some extent it is recognized. For example, we had some protest around increasing fuel prices a couple of years ago, a bit similar to the yellow vest reaction in France. which of course, if you live in a very big, well, what's the word? Not densely populated country like Sweden, if you're in the rural areas, you will consume more fuel. You will have other mobility needs. So I think the conflict is in some ways already there. In our research, we're looking also at aviation, domestic flying, and how many rural cities want to have their airports as a way of sort of trying to promote local economic growth. Again, I think that as a kind of meta divide conflict line, it's a little bit, we haven't seen so much mobilization yet in a systematic way. It's more issue-based, but I would not be surprised if there is a kind of more mobilization within the regional development policy vis-a-vis the climate transition that Sweden is trying to now roll out. So it's a good question, and I think we will see more discussion in that space.
Thank you very much.
Thank you also from my side. We decided to go a little bit more into the break, so 5 minutes we take from the break in order to keep the discussion a little bit ongoing. And just to the previous point, I'm not sure if there are regional differences here in Sweden with regard to houses and the construction of houses. But when you look, for example, Sweden, Costa Rica, in Costa Rica you don't need a house with thick walls with bricks, but people are also happy with putting less resources into the houses. Yeah, so there are also geographic differences in resource use here, and our rural urban issue perhaps also. But coming back to the next question in the chat, it's about the instrument mix, the governance through goals, which you mentioned. And when you talked about this, I thought also myself, also those conventions, those rules which were originally used, yeah, they have goals in there because they have a preamble, and the preamble often states the goal, and then the more concrete rules come in the conventions and so, yeah. So there's also this combination between goals and then a certain instrument mix in the past. So and this question asks, are the SDGs and the entire idea of government through goals useful at all? Are they a diversion that distracts us from thinking on key topics such as how are governments and companies controlled and the key importance of democratizing both workplaces and states? Sorry, broad question again, but yeah, maybe we can have our thoughts and then we wrap up.
Thank you so much. My apologies. A really, really interesting question. Are the SDGs more of a diversion than not? And I mean, in my view, they are great as this framework of exactly goals, but maybe we, and when I say we, it's really a collective of policymakers, researchers, diverse group of actors. We have maybe ascribed them a little bit too much weight in a way that we sort of stop short that, okay, we kind of expect or assume that the goals in and of themselves will incite action. But I think what we're now seeing is that you really need to have these either accountability mechanisms or really connecting SDGs to the sort of mainstream political agendas if you want to see any action. So I think you're also very right on the fact that governance through rules also had goals guiding those rules, of course, and we had something like 300 goals on just environment before the SDGs. But with SDGs, we sort of stopped short at the goal. So I think they are not a diversion at all, and they definitely provide that glue in international society, and they provide a language that many actors can speak. But what I would like to see in this follow-up is much more focus on accountability and sort of reporting progress in new ways. I find that the voluntary national reviews are a little bit cautious. They don't really take an evaluative approach, saying that this measure was actually successful or it wasn't. And this can, of course, really be addressed by researchers, independent research that evaluates measures towards the SDGs in an independent and critical way.
Thank you very much, Åsa. We have a few questions left, but sorry, we are working into the break and we need to respect the times because people are transitioning to the parallel sessions right now. And as you mentioned in the beginning, we also need to break off from the screens for a little while. So I suggest that all of you that have been listening, just walk about and exercise a little bit and take a short break. And go to your parallel sessions, and we will see you back again here from the studio in the afternoon. Volker, perhaps you also want to say a few final words.
Thank you also very much for being with us and giving your insightful thoughts really and the discussion. Sorry for the late questions which we got just on our screen. We really cannot address them, but we hope we can save the chat somehow for all the participants so that you can also have a further view on those questions. And thank you, and remind after the breakout rooms, please go to the poster session, take your lunch with you and chat with the poster presenters. We have a little bit of different process now in the poster session this time. So go there please after the parallel rooms and have a participation there also. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Have a nice break and see you at 11:30 here in Swedish time and whatever time it is in your country. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody, for the conference of International Sustainable Development Research Society. And I hope you enjoyed the beautiful pictures of the surrounding of our campus here in Östersund at Mid Sweden University. It's beautiful both in summer and in winter, so hope to see you here sometime. My name is Katrin Johansson. I'm professor in organizational communication here at Mid Sweden University, and together with my colleague, Professor Volker Mauerhofer, we are hosting this conference. And today we have a really interesting program to look forward to in the afternoon with three panelists that are going to do some speeches for us on social sustainability and the sustainable development goals. So very much welcome to all of you, and Volker.
Without further ado, welcome also from my side. I want to introduce to you our first speaker after some very small housekeeping issues. The first one is the very evening today we have a mentorship mingle program, so please join it at 5:30, and we have tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock the second membership meeting. Also everybody welcome, also non-members. So this was the small announcement which I wanted to make because everybody is listening and watching. And now we come to our first very prominent plenary speaker, and that's Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Sécher. She's a Leverton visiting professor at the University of Cambridge, and she's also a full professor of law at the University of Waterloo. And I met Marie-Claire several times at different international settings. Last time in Sharm el-Sheikh, actually at Elizabeth's conference. Elizabeth was presenting yesterday as a speaker. Marie-Claire is active as well in legal issues related to different environmental issues, procedural and material, substantial legal issues. And I think she can introduce herself best, because if I continue with her long list of achievements, we would be in 15 minutes not finished. So Elizabeth, please, welcome. The floor is yours. And Marie, sorry. Still not enough sleep. Marie, the floor is yours. Yeah. And welcome to our conference, welcome to our session. Maybe you are still unmuted, but let's see. Let's open our full screen for you, and you have 15 minutes, please, for your presentation, and then we have a little bit of Q&As regarding understanding. And please, go ahead.
It is lovely to be here with you. I am honored to be able to join the conference today and also to join so many old friends. I will be speaking today about pandemic recovery, the SDGs and the law. And this is part of an ongoing research project that I'm leading together with colleagues in Canada and in Switzerland, among other countries worldwide, at the University of Cambridge. So I'm very, very pleased to be with you. Thank you for your kind introduction. It's an honor to be confused with Elizabeth Mrema, who is certainly a very, very dear friend and mentor, but unusual to do so as well. So it's a first time for me on that one. I will especially be looking at international challenges, converging complex crises, then global sustainable development, seizing the investment opportunity of our century, then local experiences and ways to align pandemic recovery measures with the SDGs, before briefly touching on future directions and educating for capacity and creativity. So this is a social sustainability look at the law and the SDGs. It is no surprise to those in this conference that we are facing a complex convergence of crises. Wicked problems of climate change and species extinction, coupled with rising poverty and hunger, and exacerbated by a global health pandemic, threaten to undermine decades of social and economic development efforts. Recent findings of global science are signaling severe and rising risks. While these risks may threaten the poor and vulnerable first and most profoundly, they affect all of humanity. Just as one example, as you can see, the warnings that we are receiving now of rising human development pressures, and you can see the Human Developmental Index and how much of the world is still left in those dark colors, and the shattering of planetary boundaries. And you can see the planetary boundary threshold indicator of my colleagues looking at climate change, biodiversity loss, land system change, nitrogen and phosphate flows already having passed anything close to safe, and other areas moving quickly into the orange. And also, of course, the likely economic impacts over the next few years of COVID-19, contracting the world economy. And this is being layered on top of challenges we already know, not just global challenges such as climate change, where we are looking at 99% of our coral reefs projected to die off as warming reaches 2%, at 37% of the global population suffering from heat waves and extreme impact, including here in Victoria, British Columbia, where I'm currently located at 4 a.m. And also devastating droughts, floods, and forest fires that are rising exponentially, and the season is just starting here. But we're also looking at biodiversity crisis and food insecurity. 1 million animal and plant species threatened with extinction in only a few years. I'm hoping that Marcos will speak more of that, given his extreme expertise in this area. 2.01 billion people living in moderate food insecurity, and 704 million people facing severe food insecurity, with 47 million children under 5 suffering from undernutrition. And at the same time, on the social side of sustainability, poverty, water scarcity, loss of access to health, and failing infrastructure affecting people's lives. While we face these combined crises, we also look at rising risks and limited preparedness for pandemics. And I note in particular, in August 2019, the World Health Organization's global body finding that the world is not prepared for a fast-moving, virulent respiratory pathogen pandemic in August 2019. And these global wicked problems, which are increasing in severity and impact, are risks, but not truly surprises. The international community has been examining scientific data, raising the alarm, and struggling to negotiate responses for over 75 years, 3/4 of a century. And international conferences and debates have been leading slowly to clear definitions of problems, to general commitments to cooperate, to fragmented, incoherent, conflicting, and sometimes even overlapping attempts to act together. I won't go through in detail this very familiar chart on the global policy level, but simply highlight the 1992 UN conference on the human environment held in Stockholm, but also, of course, the 1992 Rio Summit, the 2002 World Summit in Johannesburg, and of course, not just the 2012 Rio +20, but also the 2015 adoption of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal in New York. And indeed, these Sustainable Development Goals do present a challenge and the opportunity of our century. In law and in policy, we are not restarting from zero. There is a common global agenda. 17 goals building on the MDGs and the 1992-2012 agenda allow us 169 targets measurable with indicators, providing a common framework to facilitate cooperation and action for all countries, developed or developing, a succinct set of public policy priorities and time-bound targets. These goals address global economic challenges. They address global social challenges of human rights violations, cultural survival, exclusion of women, marginalization, and they address environmental challenges. Many think that the goals are policy and they are non-binding. That may be the case, but they are more than this on the law, because every SDG is backed by a series of international treaties and refer in many cases directly to those binding hardcore treaties. Treaties with over 189 parties in some cases on the social side. For instance, No Poverty, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And these treaties do have binding commitments that contribute directly to the SDGs. They also set up regimes that assist in achieving those SDGs and create structures and frameworks for reporting that can be activated. However, we face an investment gap. Between 5 to 7 trillion per year, according to some estimates, and 175 billion a year just to deal with extreme poverty, for instance. Many projects have already been committed, but there has been a question since the SDGs were adopted in 2015. How will we be able to raise the funds necessary to do the rest? At the same time, governments globally are putting together new economic stimulus for pandemic recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in over 185.29 million cases and more than 4.01 million deaths worldwide, actually by June this year. And we've also seen losses on the economic side with the threat of an economic contraction of 5.2%. So the scale of pandemic recovery funding, 10 trillion were announced in just the first 2 months. Investments in the UK alone total more than 132 billion, and indeed, with additional announcements that have been made recently, quite a bit more. We're taking on public deficit to fund this. We're trying to spend our way out of a recession. So we have a gap of funding needed for the SDGs. And we have a set of funding that is being put together to stimulate economic recovery. And I think this is one of the most important opportunities for action that our world has faced. I'm going to only give a couple of examples today in order to be respectful to my other panelists. We have opportunities to act on SDG 13, climate action, together with SDG 7, affordable and clean energy. We also have opportunities to act on SDG 15, life on land, together with zero hunger. And we even have opportunities to act on clean water and sanitation, together with good health and well-being, or no poverty, together with infrastructure and industry. The research that we've been leading just over the last year and a half shows that not only do we have international treaty commitments in SDG 7 and SDG 13, but we also have pandemic recovery measures that are being announced, 1.5 billion for new jobs from climate technologies, and a new Green Deal in the EU aiming to position Europe as a first carbon neutral continent. Australia providing investment in renewable energy and green technologies. Norway providing fiscal incentives to encourage investment in green recovery and transition, in energy efficiency and sustainable transportation. The UK's 200 million to develop energy efficiency technologies, home retrofits, and to reduce the carbon footprint of the transport sector. Around the world, as we're starting to also study, there are actually regulatory enablers in place to ensure that these extra funds are spent in a way that the SDGs can achieve. On the ending hunger and the life on land side, similarly, there are crucial global treaty commitments on which we've struggled for implementation for decades in some cases. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, committing to combat disease and malnutrition through the provision of adequate nutritious foods, relates directly to SDG 2. And of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, the CITES are all there to back up and support the Life on Land SDG. And similarly, we can trace post-pandemic measures of all kinds, including in the Gambia with a national food program reaching 84% of households, in Ethiopia, in Samoa, in the Kyrgyz Republic, with temporary price controls and a food security program. And in each country, there are law and policy enablers that again will either help or hinder the development and the delivery of this funding and the achievement of the SDG. I'm not going to focus on the other SDGs in order to be careful with time, but I'll simply underline that on the biodiversity front, similarly, we can see Canada committing £763 million on a nature legacy, Pakistan hiring unemployed day laborers to plant saplings, Germany with forest conservation and management, and New Zealand with investments in restorations of wetlands and riverbanks and removing invasive species. When I worked as general counsel for the Ramsar Treaty Secretariat, we struggled to find even just a small amount for the conservation of wetlands. And yet now we have economic stimulus funding that is being announced that is meant to help us to achieve this important SDG and could contribute a great deal to the success of that international law. So I'll skip through some of my discussion of water and sanitation and health and some of my discussion of ending poverty. These questions are here and you can ask me about them in our conversation afterward. And I'll simply move to the last part of my invitation to us all. And this, of course, is not an invitation to the law, but an invitation to those who dream it, who commit to it, who implement. And that is the people behind the law. Even if the necessary resources can be mobilized and accountably managed, a second gap is thrown into sharp relief. A vast creativity and capacity chasm is opening in the road ahead. Understanding, awareness supported by new research, new skills and development, and by quality education, an SDG in its own right, are needed to advance the achievement of each SDG and the 169 target. New knowledge is needed, and this is where this conference steps in, to prepare future generations to be resolute and resilient in the face of impacts that centuries of unsustainable development have already set in motion. This is a role for this body, the ISDRS, and for universities, colleges, and research and innovation institutions worldwide. In the law, 167 out of 186 NDCs under the Paris Agreement, just to pick one example of one SDG and one treaty, are saying that they need and they are requiring major legal and institutional reform in order to achieve the Paris Agreement objectives in their country. They're committing to it. And yet, to undertake that scale of legal institutional reform in 167 countries, where are the climate lawyers? I don't know about you, but in Canada, I think we have about 9 climate lawyers, and 5 of them are my former students. That is a gap of epic proportion that is yawning at our feet, just in one SDG and one discipline law. Imagine globally how much work we have awaiting us. And these are opportunities for young, capable, brilliant graduates and professionals who could contribute. Rather than driving Ubers, they could be working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with the economic stimulus funding that has already been committed. Of course, the analysis these days is showing us that not all economic stimulus funding is going in the right direction, and that is what the law is for. We have a great deal of work to do to ensure that we can channel these funds and this investment and this energy in the direction that is needed. So, our challenge and opportunity as researchers, educators, and also advisors across all fields is not just to scale up the opportunities we're providing for graduates and to encourage our students to enter careers in these areas and to create their own livelihoods and their own new directions, but also to scale up the research that makes a different economy possible, an economy that achieves our sustainable development goals and that finally meets those binding treaty commitments that we've taken on worldwide and must take more seriously. And in order to meet those binding creativity and commitment challenges through the international accords that we've made and through the problems that we need to solve, I will leave one last challenge on all of your desks. Our challenge and opportunity as researchers, educators, and also advisors is to speak truth to power. We can convene public events like this one to raise awareness, We must also advise policy leaders, lawmakers, and business on the rules, standards, and methods to assess and align pandemic recovery measures with the SDGs and related legal obligations, addressing key local gaps and priorities in each case. And we must pilot and analyze innovative solutions as a group. As future directions, I think we have a challenge of epic proportion that we are ideally positioned to meet. Countries continue to dedicate hundreds of trillions toward pandemic recovery, and private finance ideally mobilizes to complement. But these investments must focus on advancing the key targets prioritized in the SDGs, as backed by binding treaty regimes. The surveys of recent measures offer inspiration and potential lessons, and each country can do the same. In order to bridge the coming capacity chasm, research, education, and professional institutions can play a crucial role, strengthening skills, opening opportunities, sharing data, assessing alignment, advising law and policy leaders and business, and increasing accountability for effectiveness. I'm going to leave you with this quote, which one of my team members, Tejas Rao, provided. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred and our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through light with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And that, of course, is novelist Arundhati Roy in 2020. Thank you.
For your inspiring and enthusiastic insights, and I think they were so clear. That
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire, and we appreciate so much you being with us 4 a.m. in the morning to deliver this urgent and energizing speech.
Can you help me to understand? So we have a question of, at least it's a question of, formulated as question of understanding. We will see if it's a question of substance. How the binding treaties country doesn't fulfill this obligation. Yeah, also the question is on the borderline, but we leave it in there. So can you help me to understand how the binding treaties that underline many of the SDGs are enforced if a country doesn't fulfill its obligations? That's, of course, the $100 million question for international treaty governance.
Well, I happen to be an international lawyer, of course, and I work with governments, sometimes serving as general counsel, senior legal advisor, and sometimes with our Center for International Sustainable Development Law, giving advice and information based on the research that we do. And in each treaty regime, Carrie, there is a compliance mechanism. It's like the traffic rules. People will jaywalk, but because the laws are there, they're a little bit more careful when there's lots of trucks going by. And they know also what the rules are, and they will sometimes be faced with consequences when they break them. Treaty regimes work the same way. There isn't just a global police force, of course, and you can't just send everyone to jail when the country breaks the law, but you can bring them into compliance. And in many cases, that compliance challenge is not actually about an unwillingness or even a lack of recognition of the urgency of the problem. Countries don't fail to fulfill their obligations under the UN Convention to combat desertification and drought because they don't understand how important desertification and drought will be for their country and for their people. They fail due to lack of capacity, lack of cooperation, lack of assistance in many cases. And if I talk to my colleagues who have only 4 lawyers in their entire ministry that are working on these issues, they are not saying we're out of compliance and we are late with our report because we don't feel like it and deserve to be punished. They say, please, can you think of anyone who can help us to get this report done in time so that we can meet our obligations? And that is a challenge that the SDGs are squarely there to address. They set up a cooperation framework. They ensure that actors are aligned to address the key goals that have been set as priorities by all countries. And the binding treaties that underlie the SDGs are enforced in the myriad ways that each regime has set up to do so. In the Paris Agreement, it's a compliance committee. Countries that haven't fulfilled their obligations come in front of that committee, they explain why, and they ask most of the time for assistance, which is granted by others sitting on the committee. It's not a perfect system. Some people would rather just be able to throw all of the countries into jail, but it's one that works for international cooperation as well as it can. I think that most of the work we need to do in terms of actually fulfilling obligations has a great deal more to do with meeting commitments in a manner that is sticky, that is sustainable, that will actually continue to work on the ground after the initial assistance is over. And that is something that everyone, including our own conference, could certainly do a better job of improving. So that's a very general answer to an actually excellent question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have to go further. Thank you so much, Marie, and stay with us, hopefully. Don't fall asleep, please. And Victoria, I didn't know that you're in Victoria. Sorry for that. I thought you're in Switzerland or in UK or in Montreal. Okay, then let's go forward, please. I think we go now to the next plenary speaker, which is Georgie Carino. Georgie, welcome to us here. And I hope you are in the Philippines, because, or are you also somewhere else in the world? So I'm not sure if I want to know what the time is with you, because I have to apologize another time. And
I'm here in the Philippines.
you're in the Philippines,
Yeah.
but it's already night, right?
8
Yeah.
o'clock.
8 o'clock. Okay, so that's more convenient than 4 o'clock in the morning. Georgie is Ipaloa. I have to put my glasses on, sorry. Ipalo Igorot from the Cordilleras in the Philippines, and she is a senior policy advisor of the Forest Peoples Program. And we met actually at quite many international settings, at the CBD, at other conventions and conferences, and she is very enthusiastic proponent of the rights of indigenous and local peoples and local communities particular. And I would like to give you, without further ado, the floor, please. And please give your presentation 15 minutes, and we do again 5 minutes of understanding questions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I was originally going to use a PowerPoint, but I decided that I just give my talk instead. So greetings to everyone from all different regions and time zones. I'm talking today from Baguio City, the Philippines, which is also the ancestral homeland of the Ibaloy people. Today, I wish to address our conference theme of social sustainability and the sustainable development goals from the perspective of an advocate for indigenous people's rights, having engaged in multiple policy arenas, including the sustainable development processes, and currently the ongoing negotiations on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Our days are dominated by headlines about the COVID-19 pandemic, accelerating global warming and climate change, and alarming biodiversity decline, as already presented by our earlier speaker. Amidst disturbing news about alarming loss of lives in indigenous communities, there are also reports that governments are rolling back human rights and environmental protection laws at this time of community lockdown. Starkly so in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and my own country, the Philippines. Today, there are increasing numbers of poor and hungry people, whilst ultra-rich individuals are flying into space. So global social inequalities are deepening and widening, which brings us back to the Sustainable Development Goals, with the pledge to leave no one behind, which I think is the biggest challenge in the global transformative agenda. Because I consider imbalances in our systems of governance, institutions, and decision-making at all levels as probably actual drivers in the global crisis of biodiversity, climate change, and sustainable development. And I say this despite understanding and working on changes and improvements in the global policy frameworks. I listened to Asa Person's keynote talk this morning, highlighting the neglect of national implementation of SDG 10 on reducing inequality within and between countries. And having listened to many voluntary national reports, as well as contributions from civil society, it is clear that the whole of society is not yet fully engaged, and in fact, is also being left behind in the entire SDG process and in other international treaties. And I think we need to examine this because this is, I think, at the center of the social dimension that we need to address. And of course, indigenous peoples and local communities are among those furthest left behind, according to social indicators. So as social actors and activists, we ask ourselves, how can we contribute to strategic decision-making and enabling transitions towards transformational change? Specifically, how are indigenous peoples working to inform and shape global policies towards greater inclusion and hence more equitable and sustainable outcomes? I will try to answer this question with reference to the current negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The co-equivalent strategy on biodiversity as the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. Today, these policy instruments are emerging as guiding interrelated actions under a common agenda for change. Therefore, the outcomes of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework negotiations under the CBD will be a major test regarding states' duties to uphold their obligations to respect, protect, and promote indigenous peoples' human rights in multilateral environmental agreements. Recent research, including by ISDRS and the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and also our own publication, Local Biodiversity Outlooks, has shown the vital contributions to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and the related sustainable development and climate goals that are being made by indigenous peoples. And I will just highlight a few. Territorial management practices and customary governance that is actually securing most of the world's biodiversity, contributing to nature conservation and restoration, co-constructing knowledge for assessment and monitoring through community-based monitoring systems, playing key roles in environmental governance across scales. In fact, it is through advocacy of indigenous peoples, but also civil society, that these progressive elements in the global treaties are being accepted. Of course, because these are addressing the global crisis, and of course, the path towards the importance of changing is simply becoming so evident. Also, we are active in countering the drivers of unsustainable resource use and resisting environmental injustices, and offering alternative conceptualizations of interrelations between people and nature. So I'll just highlight a few areas of the current post-2020 negotiations where these issues are being addressed. Now, the post-2020 biodiversity vision is that by 2050, we have societies living in harmony with nature. That is a real huge task, right? And I think that there is this continuity of living in harmony with nature amongst indigenous peoples and local communities who are directly living in nature, are facing the daily challenges of management, production, and creating benefits from nature, as well as contributing to improving nature. So nature is not just contributing to us, we are also contributing to nature in this mutual and reciprocal relationship. The biggest area of negotiation, well, one, is the expansion of protected areas to 30% of lands and seas from the current 17%. Now, even the scientists accept, and research now confirms, that most of these areas are now the lands of territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, which continue to be the best conserved areas today. Now, in the past, we know the history of fortress conservation, and that has actually created a conflict between the conservation community and indigenous peoples. And now, with the imperative for conservation, will we be able to resolve this conflict? Not just in words, because conservation policy has already moved a lot in recent years, but mostly in the practice, behavior, and institutional arrangements of these big conservation organizations. And not just the conservation organizations, because of course, governments will be making these decisions. And yet, will they concede public land and meet their obligations to demarcate, delineate, and actually title and give legal recognition for indigenous communities? So that's one big area. The other one is the whole area of sustainable use. Because actually, the big economic and consumption and production systems are unsustainable. And yet currently, the bulk of incentives and finance being directed post-COVID-19 will go exactly to those institutions, hopefully for their transformation, but less than 1% is currently going directly to indigenous peoples and local communities who are actually in direct stewardship of these resources. And when I hear nature-based solutions and see that, again, these funds are going to the biggest investors, then how do we reconcile this conflict of use of resources? So perhaps the subsidies previously were for unsustainable practices, but will they now go to nature-based solutions, but still for the same economic actors? And there is also a big area of negotiation on the linkages between science, indigenous knowledge, and other systems of knowledge in order to harness the best possible evidence and knowledge to guide decision-making. So I'm very happy that there are big, good developments, for example, in IPBES and in other research institutions, as well as on the recently adopted open science recommendations by UNESCO. But finally, the final one, which I think hopefully will get a good sailing, is that indigenous peoples and local communities are supposed to be included in environmental decision-making at all levels, including respect for our lands, territories, and resources. So I'm actually very glad that the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was just released on Monday, it's much improved over the previous zero draft. So I think the co-chairs have been listening carefully to the inputs. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 has not allowed face-to-face negotiations, and that has actually really affected even indigenous peoples in terms of our participation. But what I've highlighted in my talk is that we need to pay very careful attention to the social dimensions and social equity issues of all of these treaties, because it is actually this that will lead to transformation. If you look at the curve for transformation, it is those previous outliers, those left behind and marginalized, who have the greatest, who have really great stakes. Of course, everyone has our concern here. But we have real commitments for change. We are doing a lot of work on the ground, and we are hoping that there will be great solidarity in addressing these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joji. It was great hearing you talk, and we are very, very grateful to hear from your perspectives, and we are really glad to have this dimension of the indigenous peoples and the local communities perspective in the conference. So this is so important to highlight as we today are talking about this theme of social sustainability, but also, as you highlighted, social sustainability and equality is so interrelated to the other dimensions, the economic and the environmental dimensions. And I really hope that we can gain from your knowledge of living in harmony with nature and use indigenous people also as role models for this and this culture of thinking in the future. And I also hope, like you highlighted, that the resources that are put from after the COVID pandemic will also go to nature conservation also for other actors than they have done before. So really important highlights of your speak. Thank you so much for engaging and committing in the evening in Philippines. And I don't know if we have any questions in the chat, Volker.
One, and it's actually a yes or no question. So we briefly take it, and I ask for a brief answer. Joji, the question is, when you talk about expansion of protected land for nature and indigenous communities, do you think about it as a regeneration of the commons? So not exclusively for the indigenous communities? So please, a brief answer. It's a, yeah.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Because I think in order for everyone to respect our place, we have to respect everyone's place. So the transformation in nature-cultural relations is for everyone in the world. It's not confined or isolated to indigenous peoples and local communities. The transformation we're seeking is for all of society and all of the planet. So the commons, even the cities, everyone has to do their bit. The governments in terms of land use planning, and everyone else.
Great answer.
Thank you. And I just want to address all of you because there was someone, I think the Shubshana Madana raised his hand or her hand in this session, and I'm sorry, but it's not possible for the audience to put on the microphone and speak. So please, if you have any questions, please use the chat function and we will address these questions and you can interact in this way. So it's not possible for us, like in the parallel sessions, for you to have the sound and the camera on. So sorry for that. Now we have to move on to the third speaker.
Yes, and we are pleased to welcome Marcus Regis da Silva. He's the Executive Director of the Inter-American Institute of Global Change Research. It's an intergovernmental organization. And I met Markus the first time 2012, I think, in Hyderabad, when he was still in his former UN position, and he gave a fantastic talk there. And he's now with his institute also, meanwhile, a partner organization of the International Society of Sustainable Development Research. We're looking forward to a great cooperation. And Markus, welcome here at this conference. It's not too late or too early for you, I think. So I hope so. And yeah, the floor is yours, Markus. Please give us your 15 minutes talk, and then we have again the 5 minutes of questions of understanding. And then we enter the plenary finally. Thank you.
Thank you, Volker. Volker, I'll be sharing my screen. I'm trying to share. And I hope everyone can see it. And I'll be speaking on the role of transboundary, transdisciplinary, and open science in achieving the SDGs, but I'll be giving a regional perspective to it. And it'll be a little bit different from the other speakers, which incidentally I'm a little bit humbled by the quality of their presentations, which were absolutely excellent. But it'll give a different perspective. The II is a regional organization, 19 governments from the Arctic all the way to the tip of Patagonia, but it's a unique organization. It's the only one similar to it in that it supports international scientific, transdisciplinary, transboundary research to generate data required for policymaking. It's disinterested, it's objective, it doesn't make policy, it provides the scientific information required for policy. And that places it in a very interesting space, because if you see the shared priorities, they are defined at the national, regional, international level by the frameworks. And among these frameworks, the SDGs are probably the most important one, because the UN Strategic Plan for Biodiversity, which is being retaught in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, tries to align with it. We see the Paris Agreement and another of other frameworks, among many other different ones. What is the traditional model of science to policy at the regional level, or if not the international level? Well, countries identify a problem, say transboundary genetic flow, that must come from a regional international collaboration, meaning that no one country can solve it alone. The scientific bodies say will use multilateral environmental agreements, such as the SBSTAs, will make recommendations, and these go through a blender type process and are converted into policy. However, there is a problem in that we see an incredible fragmented governance and treaty congestion. A study by the UN in 2010 claimed that there are 900 multilateral and over 1,500 bilateral treaties dealing with environmental issues. Now, many have questioned the methodology used in this study, but nevertheless, the fragmentation does exist. And I'll give you an example. If you're a minister and you needed to know all the obligations that your country may have under all of the treaties and under all of the organizations, you may be hard pressed. You have different governance structures. The biodiversity treaties, for instance, are administered by by UNEP, some by the FAO, others by UNESCO, and one's not even a UN-administered treaty. It's under and hosted by IUCN. And none of those treaties are UN treaties. They have their own governance, conference of the parties, governance-making systems. And then you have unexpected results. This came out in Science. CBD limits biodiversity research. So we have a fragmented environment with possibly conflicting decisions, and we have treaties that may be putting limits in the type of research that policy makers require for more effective policies. 71 signatories came from the Americas. Now, this article was referring to the Nagoya Protocol on Excess and Benefit Sharing, which is a protocol under the CBD. And it was identified that the problem is particularly acute where there is a poor policy to science interface resulting from weak scientific institutions. Now, this is not just a problem in Latin America, it's probably a problem in many nations of the world. So within the international environmental governance, three issues come to the fore: national sovereignty, liability and redress, and enforcement. And I'd like to echo what Marie-Claire said, that mechanisms for liability and redress and enforcement are weak or non-existent. I'll give you an example. Under CITES, for instance, nations have, as the previous speaker said, many obligations towards indigenous peoples. However, CITES can, if they wish, move one species from one appendix to another, which would, of course, increase or decrease its conservation and sustainable use status without any communication with the indigenous peoples from which those resources could be in their territories. Now, within this fragmented governance environment, the Americas has been uniquely effective. Its GRULOC is an effective negotiating bloc in many MEAs. And you have to understand the difficulty that developing areas have in negotiations against we'll say, the more have nations. And I believe it's the homogeneity of its historical context in action that provides many opportunities for implementation of the SDGs, particularly when you think that the SDGs are inextricably linked. The II, for instance, is a reflection of that desire. It's the need to establish a collaborative mechanism to provide policymakers with best information. It reflects the regional framework found in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, I'll mention that Article 2 says, promote regional cooperation for interdisciplinary research and pursue on a regional scale that research cannot be pursued by any individual state. This treaty was established in 1992, and it dates at the same time as the Rio Conventions, for example. Transdisciplinary was very little used, but the interdisciplinary text in it does provide the way towards transdisciplinary research. It functions as an ecosystem to understand national priorities as defined under the fragmented regional international frameworks, say the SDGs. And this context provides the scientific activities, and capacity building at the regional level it must support. Now, there's a number of issues facilitating transdisciplinary research in open science. Public investment versus commercialization, for example. 2/3 of investments for research and development in Latin America and Caribbean are from the public sector. It still hasn't been as commercialized as in other regions of the world. And this has led to a culture that knowledge, particularly public funded knowledge, is considered a public good. And as such, it should not be subjective to privatization. I'll give you an example. The state constitution of Sao Paulo stipulates 1% of all state taxes must be invested in research. Sao Paulo has the highest GDP in Brazil, and whose economy, depending on who you speak to, is among the 10 top economies in the world. And this is a sizable public investment that made Sao Paulo a publishing public powerhouse. It's also a pioneer in the provision of open access to information, which is one of the pillars of open science. Beginning in the 70s, you see regional collaborations to establish databases, particularly CLASS in 75, Periodic in 78, and Latindex in 1995, to provide full and open access to scientific literature published in Latin America. Now, this has provided open access to scientific literature and also a public culture for funding and implementation. The Latin American Council of Social Sciences, Scientific Electronic Library Online, REDALIC, and the Federated Network of Institutional Repositories of Scientific Publications. This is a unique, say, culture on open access to publications, which incidentally is under tremendous pressure at the moment. Now, the regional governance instruments also facilitate this. We see the countries are ratifying the regional agreement on access to information, public participation in justice and environmental matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. This follows very much the Airhouse Convention in Europe, and it does provide a framework for the public to use for greater public participation in environmental justice. I think this is one of the most important frameworks that have been adopted in Latin America in a long time. There's the II and also the Panama Declaration on Open Science. Now, the problem is that Latin America and the Caribbean is not immune to the global trends impacting on transdisciplinary and open science. And among these, the one that preoccupies me the most is the public disparagement of scientific methods by some world leaders. It is an absolute disgrace. I could go on a diatribe about this, but again, Latin America is not immune to this, and it is having a detrimental effect on the impact of scientific information in public policy making. There's also the advent of predatory publishing, where the commercialization of publishing, which allows very fast publications for payment, particularly because of the academic models to publish or perish, again, is having an impact on the open culture. And again, the continued fragmentation of environmental governance. I'll give you an example. My governments have asked me questions on solar climate intervention, usually known as geoengineering. And yet no existing governance instrument adequately can address the questions that it has. The CBD has passed a number of questions, on a number of decisions on geoengineering, but the CBD, geoengineering doesn't fall within its three objectives. It has been discussed under UNEP, the WMO, and it has been sent to IPCC. But IPCC will probably, include it in the assessments, and then we'll go back to the fragmented environment. So what we have is also a lack of true equitable scientific collaboration between developed countries and the global South. And we see this very much within this COVID crisis. A number of articles where Southern scientists from the global South have shared genomic data, and yet they have received very little accreditation for their efforts. There has been significant decreases to public financial scientific support and a grounded lack of understanding or support for transdisciplinary and open science. I believe that Latin America and the Caribbean offer a unique opportunity to support a culture of collaborative, multinational, transdisciplinary scientific projects in support of the SDGs, keeping in mind that the SDGs are inextricably linked. You cannot take a reductionist approach to the solution of any one goal or target. It has a very well-established network of peers, and it is uniquely effective in the articulation of its needs and in the involvement of scientists and policymakers in international fora. In summary, Latin America and the Caribbean have, if it is willing to, overcome challenges and build opportunities, strengthen linkages to the global frameworks, and strengthen its leadership and articulate better its vision, keeping in mind the negative trends that are impacting on it. I went through this very quickly, but I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos, for your tremendous overview on issues from the regional perspective, but also linking them with the global development. So that was really interesting. And I didn't expect to see the Aarhus Convention in there. Actually, I'm working on that also in Europe. So that was surprising. And it's really a useful tool. And I hope that Latin America can also strongly go forward with that. So without further ado,
Yes, thank you, Marcos, from my side as well. I also appreciate you highlighted a lot of challenges, but also the possibilities. We have one question from the chat for understanding for you, because you were talking both on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. And the question is, how do you understand transdisciplinary research in the LA context?
Transdisciplinary research can take many different meanings. We view it as first, equitable public participation, where subjects and the public are able to be involved in any activity from the very beginning. Second, an integration of disciplines, not simply each discipline approaching the problem from its perspective, but having the disciplines merge into trying to understand a new methodology to face a different problem, a very complex problem. And third, the involvement of policymakers, again, in the design of it. Now, this has to be done in a regional context. It can't be done in a national context because a reductionist approach to the SDGs simply does not work.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. And we now move into the panel discussion, Volker.
yes, I do not see, I think, in the chat yet questions. So I might start with your own question. And that's a quite broad question, which is, what kind of science is after COVID needed related to social sustainability from your personal perspective, your continent, your discipline? Could you elaborate on this? And that is to all plenary speakers. And then we see another question already in the chat. Thank you.
So any one of you that have spoken can answer this question. I think we will have turns, so I don't know who of you want to start.
I'm happy to give two ideas. One is based on the research project we're doing that I presented on, and one is more my own personal opinion in terms of what kind of science is needed. In terms of the research project, I think one type of science that we need, and we don't have enough of, is actually the work of economists. We need to be tracking what is happening to the millions of pounds that are being dedicated to COVID recovery. And like Joji said, we need the public to be fully aware, and we need Indigenous and local communities and others to know what that debt that societies are taking on to recover is actually going toward. I mean, obviously, I try to focus as much as I can on the optimistic, positive side when I'm presenting to a group, but the other side is very clear in what I'm saying. If we aren't aligning our spending with the SDGs, what are we doing? And if people are announcing trillions of pounds and planning to spend it on new cement factories and destruction of the rainforest and further degradation of the environments that Indigenous and local communities and others depend on for survival, can't we please learn something here? And so the question that I would ask is, if we have colleagues, not me, I'm a lawyer, who have the economic knowledge to be able to fully and transparently track where this funding is going and make it available to everyone so that we can participate and help to channel it in the direction that we've agreed our priorities globally, it would make, I think, a difference to what we are not currently doing. So many efforts are already being done. And then that is on the sort of project side. On the personal side, I think we need every single discipline. We need the medics, we need the lawyers, we need the engineers, we need those who have local and Indigenous knowledge that is far beyond, that is shaped over millennia. We need people with communications abilities. And the science that they do needs to be mobilized towards not just pandemic recovery, but pandemic recovery in a different way, the transition to a more sustainable economy and system. And I will underline one thing, because I think it might help to explain why on the personal side I think this is so important. When the children who lead the climate strikes in Cambridge locally, yeah, the ones who did the die-in in front of King's College, where they all dressed in blue and lay down to simulate the floodwaters that would come. They're led by an 11-year-old, okay? So our children were there making the point, and they were invited to speak in Cambridge University for the land economy department. And they made a presentation about climate change, and they explained why they were afraid and worried and angry. And they had a standing ovation from the academics at the Cambridge department. And then the head of the department said, "You children are so articulate and so committed and so passionate. What do you want to do when you grow up? Because we would love to see more children like you in our program." And the three of them stood up, and the first one said, "Well, I would have liked to be an artist, but I want to be a doctor because so many people are going to be hurt and dying." And the second one said, I would have actually liked to be a teacher, but I don't know if there are going to be children left to teach. And the third one said, "How can you ask us that? We've just told you we have 20 years. Are we going to grow up?" Which isn't exactly the kind of future that you want to be telling your children about. And yet this was honestly the kind of problem they're worrying about now at 11 when they think about their future. You know, one of them wants to help cure people who are hurt by the forest fires that he knows are going to come. Yeah. And so I do think on a personal level, we need to be offering something different, and we need to do it quickly. And that would be my personal plea.
Thank you. Georgie, Marcos. Yeah.
Yes. There is currently real erosion and decline in indigenous and local knowledge. And that is going hand in hand with the loss of biodiversity, because both are interconnected, right? So there's actually a recent article that has just come out, which is the scientists' plea to address the loss of indigenous and local knowledge. Because if we lose this, unless we turn it alongside the protection of biodiversity, this will really be a very serious loss for all of us. So on a personal side, I'm very committed to that. I'm working with a network of centers of distinction on indigenous and local knowledge, where we are putting our efforts towards revitalization, transmission, and also visibility and documentation. On the other area that I'd really like to see is a lot more collaboration between indigenous knowledge, science, and all the other knowledge systems, exactly in this transdisciplinary way that was described. So I do support open science, and that open science includes a respect and inclusion of the full knowledges amongst humanity, right? So I'm very happy to see that this is now happening well within IPBES, the platform, intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But they have developed an approach paper towards working with indigenous knowledge, as well as very careful methodologies to implement within their assessments to ensure that this happens at every stage. And I think that is also the aspiration of open science, to be doing that. So I am actually optimistic about this, because there are great efforts going towards it. Thanks.
Marcos, do you want to add something?
Yes, I would. Volker, I work at the nexus of the science to policy. And most of the time, I deal primarily with national governments in a regional context. And I don't think we should underestimate the fear that governments have regarding a lessening or a decrease of national sovereignty with regard to decision making. So whatever fora they go armed with the national priorities and their national needs, hopefully in a regional context. That's why we have regional groups before the CBD meetings and so on, where they set their priorities. Within Latin America and Caribbean, the primary issue is poverty alleviation. That's very simple. And true equity in science between North and South, and true collaboration between the regions. Now, what COVID-19 has done is that it has thrown a wrench into these, how can I say, this belief that this can indeed occur, and it can occur in a very open, transparent, and philosophical way. The hoarding of the vaccines, for example, by the global North. The fact that the least developed countries haven't even started the vaccination programs. The fact that the global North is already speaking of booster shots. The fact that Southern researchers have not been accredited for their contributions to the genomic program, and so on. I could go on and on and on. And what this has done is that it has a number of governments questioning the impetus to open and transparent sharing of data, collaboration, and true transdisciplinary open science. And this is a very negative trend. My organization will do its utmost to fight it, to try to work in an equitable way, because my personal belief is that no solutions can be found or reached without an equitable approach to the science that will provide the data and generate the data that is required for the solutions. Joji is absolutely correct that if you do not have equitable and full participation of indigenous communities, you might as well write off any effort that is going to be taken.
Thank you so much for your answers. And we have now plenty of questions.
Yes, we have a number of questions in the chat. Thank you so much for this. And there are also parallel discussions going on in the chat. That's great to see. But here is a question for all of you keynotes. And the question is, it seems that we have been talking about the same problems and sort of the same solutions, but the solution seems not to have been implemented. And how do we legitimate knowledge from indigenous communities, from global south, from new fields of study or disciplines, from non-hegemonic powers towards sustainability? And that's also a very big question, but how can we legitimate knowledge and implement the solutions? What are your personal perspectives on that? Is there any one of you that want to start?
Perhaps I can just mirror Marie-Claire's opening remarks in her presentation, which I found to be absolutely excellent. We have the frameworks, and SDG is the framework of frameworks. And the SDGs should be used as the umbrella or the shield of any type of collaboration or science that is undertaken, because the SDGs are designed to be interlinked. They're not designed to be addressed individually. And the types of science that is required to be able to reach the targets under the SDGs are precisely what has been discussed in this forum: open, transdisciplinary, multinational science. I would hope Joji and Marie-Claire would add to that.
Go ahead, Marie.
No, I wanted to let you go first because I went first last time.
Yes, this issue of good policy frameworks existing, but poor implementation. All our international treaties, as also presented by Marie and Marcos, are for national implementation, right? And this issue of national sovereignty. And here, we really need to put great efforts in democratizing decision making. And this is why I actually referred to institutions as probably the drivers of this crisis. When we have institutions and behaviors in place that are very hard to change, but they do change. And this is where we can put a lot of our efforts. So for example, we found out that for the SDGs and all of the global goals, they didn't have any data on indigenous peoples. There is no aggregated data to show what the real situation is. And so we initiated a program of community-based monitoring and information systems, because we said we're probably the best experts on our situations. And so we generated this data. We developed a tool called the Indigenous Navigator, and now it's being accepted within the SDGs. It also monitors the SDGs as one of those tools which will supplement national statistics as well as other types of data from satellites or other. These are grounded data by the people who can really show the outcomes of these policies. And we can multiply those kinds of actions. So when we complain of implementation, we must ask ourselves, what have I done to implement this? And what have I done to change the implementation modalities of all of these treaties? Because yes, the frameworks are good, and I think progressively they are getting better and integrated. In the communities, all of these are integrated. They're not separate things. And so if you work closely on our priorities and work with partners and governments, then this is where the change will, the groundswell of change will begin also to move the enabling laws and policies.
Perhaps you want to share a link to your tool.
I completely agree with Joji. And I think that she's exactly right, especially about the implementation challenge. The only two little points I could add to complement is that one of the questions we asked ourselves was exactly that, which Joji has underlined. And one of the projects we were able to move forward with was to ask our international lawyers if they could look carefully at the treaties that Canada has signed with each of the First Nations just here locally in this country. And that's actually what I'm doing out on the West Coast, is meetings with my Indigenous graduate students and my colleagues and friends of many years from different Indigenous communities here who are just starting to reopen after having closed their territory during the pandemic. And they said, you know, one thing we don't understand is that these treaties are ignored sometimes, or people don't seem to be aware that we have binding legal expectations and rights. And so we were able to trace and analyze the relationship between these treaties and the Sustainable Development Goals, the alignments. And of course, as you can imagine, these treaties, which are hard fought and won by the Indigenous communities, contain a great deal of obligations on the Sustainable Development Goals. And the implementation mechanisms that are being put in place are uneven. And the people themselves, as Joji was saying, actually have the data to be able to show what's being implemented, how and why, and where the gaps still are. So I think it falls onto all of us to then do something with that information. And what we've said, this is sort of a very Canadian metaphor, but with all of the researchers, the Indigenous young people who are part of our team, and also my Indigenous colleagues who are professors co-leading, is that we will make the snowballs and give them to you to throw. and they actually do, they're doing a very good job of throwing them. Some of the terrible news that has emerged recently here in Canada, these are things that were known but hidden. And now they're coming out, you know, and people need to understand what the history is here and then move forward to something closer to what New Zealand has with the Maori. And there is will to do that. So I think that some of that science that we need, some of that legitimation that we need, you know, academics love fancy words for things. And so we call it an epistemic community, don't we? But that entire regime of stakeholders and contributors and collaborators that feel they own that treaty, that carry it close to their heart, whether it's their land claim treaty or whether it's the Paris Agreement, you know, those children out on the streets who stand up and say, we want compliance with the Paris Agreement, it's ours, you know, and they're in the Paris Agreement. That public pressure, that awareness raising is in the Paris Agreement. It's part of what civil society said they would do and is doing. So I'm sort of jumping ahead to answer a couple of the other questions that have come in, but I do think that legitimating the science and also legitimating the legal commitments and reminding decision makers, reminding lawmakers, reminding all the institutions at every level of the rights that are in those agreements and the obligations that are in those agreements is crucial, and it's something we can all do.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Or maybe before we go to this big block of ecocide related questions and comments, which I see in the chat, I would like to go to legal culture or compliance culture. And there is one comment which is a little bit also not agreeing, so that's always a good comment, so we can discuss a little bit more intensive. So it's about like this: I don't share Professor Seger's optimism regarding adherence to law and treaties. Compliance requires resources and infrastructure. Above all, respect for the rule of law generally. If the latter is lacking, as it is in many parts of the world, how we can expect that the laws backing SDGs will be followed? Also in the pandemic recovery, we need to distinguish between short-term equitable distribution of vaccines and long-term solutions. So this is a little bit of different complex. The first one is about legal culture and compliance culture, and the second one is long-term, short-term, long-term solutions. So Marie, you are directly addressed, but I invite everybody else also from the panelists to react.
Well, I think I already started to answer by accident because I thought it was a great question. But I will simply add to that earlier one that part of it has to do with understanding what we mean by our societies and our peoples and our communities, and reconnecting and making collective commitments. So when we talk about culture, when we talk about the social sustainability side, one of the things that people sometimes can agree on when they can't agree on whether their brother-in-law's cement factory should receive extra funding, you know, the one that's generating more emissions than ever, they can agree that they want to be able to face their kids across the breakfast table, or that they want to be able to go together to a quiet green place and have a family picnic. And so some reminder of those values in an intergenerational context, and I think I've written a bit on this, and colleagues like Marcel Szabo and Alexandra Harrington, the duties that we owe to future generations, recognizing fully the strong Indigenous voices that have reminded us of these duties throughout the centuries, and the rights that those as yet unborn generations have, which can sometimes be represented in the concerns of our children, can help us a little bit to understand and take more seriously the obligations that we have taken on that echo throughout the centuries to come. And it is a question of becoming wiser. It is a question of becoming more consequent, more responsible with our commitments. And that is something that is hard to do when you have an immediate concern about how much you're going to be able to sell at the market today or what you're going to be able to eat. So I think we should think very carefully about the obligations that we're placing on those who didn't create the problem, and the duties that are owed, the promises that were made in Stockholm and in Rio to address not just the environmental side of the conventions, but also the sustainable development side. But with that, we need to recognize, and I was actually speaking to some students, including a beautiful buck deer with antlers who came to join our classroom yesterday here on the West Coast, about how we define the problems that we're trying to address and how we then collectively mobilize to solve them. And that too is a question of legal culture. But the many solutions that exist at the local level all over the world, they aren't solutions that are necessarily commensurate to the amount of power that people have to be able to address the big problems that are coming at them. Joji said very well, and Marcus has also made this point from a science side, that, when in the end you're one community, if you're receiving inputs and advice from 17 different sources about how you can develop sustainably, and it is and should be your choice on how you then take that advice and go forward, that question of culture and what we can learn from each other and how we can assist each other becomes even more important. One of the most frightening things about globalization that the SDGs are there to help us with is that global culture in particular allows someone to benefit from degradation and live in a place where they don't have to see or feel any of the consequences. Others bear those burdens. And that's what law is meant to fix. Law is not there for the powerful. It's for everyone else who needs that protection. So I think wherever we can, to be able to build that culture of compliance at any level possible is part of the solution.
Thank you. Georgie, Marcos, you want to add on these issues? Long-term, short-term, culture?
Volker, very, very quickly, I'd like to mention two meetings that I've had recently. I was at a meeting of the subsidiary body on technological advice of the CBD. And one of my best friends, our careers kind of went together. He stayed at a national level and I didn't, was the head of delegation. So I go up to him and I go, gee, it's good to see you, blah, blah, blah. But then I look at the delegation and I go, why do you have so many lawyers in your delegation? This is a substa. And his answer, of course, was, do you really think I'm going to let the scientists make the recommendations that are going to COP? The second meeting was with an official whose country will call country X. And, I'm saying how we need to, the carbon, we're talking about solar climate interventions and so on and so on. And he made a curious comment saying, listen, our forests take X carbon out of the atmosphere, and the developed countries don't pay us for that service. So if I burn my forest, why should I care? They're not giving us any benefits from it. This is the type of logic, I think, that as a community, how can I say, a community of equals, of peers, have to fight, right? This is the understanding very often that guides policymaking. And this is the worst actuality that you could have at the present time, because you need equity, you need participation, and you need a transparent approach to transdisciplinary research. Now, this is where the electorate as a body in democratic regimes and representative regimes become so important. You cannot have equitable participation. You cannot speak as one voice that is representative of your electorate if the electorate forcibly are not able to impact on the direction of policy. But then again, you get these electorates that can vote for leaders that are disparaging science. So it's a very complex situation, right? It's not a give and take. We need to this is going to happen. It needs a ground level support from the public that are most affected with. And this is why I have so much admiration for the voice of indigenous peoples, because they understand their communities are in danger, and they have faced the situation first and foremost among anyone else.
Thank you. Georgie, do you want to add briefly?
Now I'd like to bring in also the important role of educators. I'm actually an educator, and a lot of these things we want can be promoted through education and social learning. And I'm always very gratified when, after having conversations or having done a class, there is always a very positive affirmation of how increasing knowledge can lead to action and can lead to empowerment. So I think in policy, we have not given sufficient attention to the importance of education, public awareness, and also good communications that will really bring us more closely together. I know that in fact, communication is now quite a dividing factor, but we should do better.
Thank you. Shall we go to the ecocide question just briefly for 5 minutes?
Thank you very much. Yes, we have almost no time left for our our discussion, but there is also a question on. Yeah, could you please scroll down for me so I can read the beginning of the question? It's now other way.
Up.
Yeah. Here is the question. The Stockholm Environment Conference of 1972 has been referred to by some of you. And in his talk at the conference, the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, that was murdered in 1986, he proposed an ecocide law. Nothing to my knowledge has happened since then. And what in your views are social aspects of ending ecocide and putting a globally binding ecocide law in place? So this might be the last question of this panel. So I don't know who of you wants to go first.
Well, if it's helpful, we did do a book with Cambridge University Press, I don't know, about 10 years ago, looking specifically at the International Criminal Court and engaging the ICC judges and others who were pressing for environmental crimes to be recognized. And we built our thinking in this book, which had many diverse voices and chapters, on the crime of genocide. And we looked at crimes of aggression. We looked at other crimes that also were recognized under the ICC statute. But we found that the crime of genocide came closest as an allegory or an analogy to what we were seeing in terms of the destruction of entire ecosystems, which then also took away the possibility of life for entire peoples. Obviously, always the question is, can local justice systems, can national criminal systems address this particular crime, or do you need an international court, which might be far from those who have been most affected and hardest to reach, to address it? And that's an open debate. I do, however, have a colleague who is working very hard on this and has come up with a new definition of the crime of ecocide that I've posted in the chat. And I think they're raising really, really interesting ideas. It's certainly a bit frightening that at the moment, if you destroy an entire area during a conflict as a weapon of war, you're violating the laws of war and you're committing a crime, a war crime. If you destroy that same area for greed and profit, there's no crime, even though you've done the exact same action and affected the same number of people. And that's something that needs some work. Not very logical.
Thank you so much, Marie-Claire. Marcos, Georgie, do you want to add something for that question?
Some countries are moving in that direction. Bolivia has added or integrated issues regarding environmental, let's say, as Mother Earth protections in their constitution. It's very strong. Whether that's enforceable or not, I don't know. But I agree with Marie-Claire, this is an ongoing discussion that is very difficult and complex. But my view is an international court will not provide the solutions, and this would have to be solved at the national level, if at all.
Yes, in addition to developments in law, the deepening understanding of the close interrelations between nature and people, as well as that humans are not alone on Earth, that in fact we have very special relationships with other wild wildlife, and that in fact in the Native American tradition, others are called our relations, right? So I think this thinking will further developments in law towards really upholding our responsibilities to the rest of creation.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you three engaging with you during 1.5 hour of your precious time in the middle of the night, in the evening, and in the middle of the day. Here.
Thank you very much. So that's what is our gift for you. We will plant for each of you 10 trees, and it's with an organization which is connected with the UN Decade of Restoration. So these are UN trees for you. I'd hope they don't grow blue, but they grow green. So, and we will send you the certificate, and thank you so much for being with us and giving your insights, sharing your talk, and answering all the questions in our chat. Perhaps we have overlooked some questions, or we couldn't have time for all the questions, but I think it was a very comprehensive session, and thank you for being with us. It was really a great pleasure.
And thank you all of the audience that participated in the session as well. We have really many participants for this panel discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. And now we will have a break of almost half an hour until the parallel sessions start. So I hope that you can go and take some refreshments and start to engage in the presentations of the research and the papers in your tracks respectively. And after this parallel sessions, there will be a common mingle for the ISDRS, right, Volker?
Yes, that's the mentorship program. And as I said before, you're all welcome. There is one part which is particular for the people who are already in the mentorship program, but those who are interested how to run such a program or who want to participate in that program, please come to us and we will accommodate you. And don't forget tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock Swedish time, the second membership meeting for those who live in a time zone for whom this 8 o'clock morning meeting time would be more appropriate. Also from non-members explicitly. So please join us in the next hours, in the next day. I'd be looking forward to have you with us again with us.
Yes, and we'll see you again in the studio tomorrow at 10 a.m. And then we are going to also listen to our final keynote speaker that I am looking very much forward to, which is Rutger Welford. So see you all soon again. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.